The Declaration of Independence was a historical document produced by certain men who were influenced by certain philosophical ideas at the time. And it was not a document that was created for the founding of the United States. The United States was not founded. It evolved from various groups of Englishmen who moved to America and developed very much along English lines. And so the Declaration of Independence was a historical document that the rebels in 1776 produced to make their case to the world. And so this notion that all men are created equal, to me, I can find ways that that's true. I mean, I have to really, really work at it. But if I want to understand something and want to resonate with it, I can do the work and find ways where this statement is true. I just don't understand the to me incredibly destructive passion to try to make this statement come true, in 2021 in ever expanding ways, so that it now covers the transgendered and every minority under the sun, and life outcomes have to be equal. Otherwise, we're not living up to the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence was a historical document produced by certain men living in history, reacting to ideas that were current at the time, that was speaking to an intellectual current at the time. And just like with George W. Bush and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the United States did not go into Iraq in 2003 to find and disarm weapons of mass destruction. That was simply the most useful rhetorical device for justifying what the Bush administration already wanted to do. So we can't just take people's declarations and accept them as fact. I mean, declarations take place within a certain context. Saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction was thought to be the most useful rhetorical exercise. And so the Declaration of Independence is a rhetorical exercise to make an appeal to the world to explain what's going on. I don't understand the idea that we then have to conform all of American life to try to fit in with the purported ideals encapsulated by the Declaration of Independence.
The New York Times. You mentioned to me that you subscribe to these major newspapers, even though you know that they're on the left, and you find them valuable, but at the same time, it's in a discriminatory sense. And I do find really fascinating. So please do tell me, how does one read the New York Times? What's your take on that?
Right. So I don't understand how any intelligent person who's interested in the world around him is not going to find several articles worth reading every day in the New York Times. And it doesn't matter if you're to the right of Attila the Hun, you're a centrist, or you're on the left. There's lots of fascinating material in there. Now, people then say to me, Luke, how can you read the New York Times? How can you subscribe to the New York Times? How can you give the New York Times credit when they bought into the Russian collusion hoax? That's only one tiny aspect of the New York Times. It's like saying, Luke, how can I take you seriously? Because in sixth grade, you used to make a lot of really rude noises in class. And in sixth grade, I used to sometimes eat ants. And I used to pull the pigtails of girls. And even today, I say and do embarrassing things. Like, everyone can be dismissed if you just focus on one thing. That's something I notice, just a human tendency. We're just wired to try to dismiss people and institutions because reality is so confusing. We just want to boil things down. So we just dismiss, for example, the New York Times because they made the Russian collusion hoax the top story for 3 years, and it turned out to be nothing. But I don't read the New York Times for its ranking of what's important in the world today. I was never able to read anything about the Russian collusion hoax without starting to get a headache. I mean, I would genuinely try to read these articles about how Trump colluded with Russia to rig the 2016 election, and my mind would just get fuzzy and start to hurt because it just didn't make any sense. So I don't read the New York Times for that. I don't read the New York Times, obviously, for its woke op-eds. But, I mean, the New York Times sometimes publishes Christopher Caldwell. He's an amazingly insightful thinker. And a lot of its cultural coverage, book coverage, overseas coverage. I mean, if you're going to trash the New York Times, then tell me a better newspaper. What's a better source of news than the New York Times? FoxNews.com? Come on, get real. The New York Times has something like 1,200, very smart, intelligent, generally left-wing journalists. But I would much rather hear from someone who's smart and on the left than someone who's a midwit and on the right. So they've got more journalists than any other news outlet of which I'm aware. They produce more thoughtful content than any other newspaper of which I'm aware. What's better than the New York Times if you want to read a daily, constantly updated source of information? I think it's still better than the Wall Street Journal, which I also subscribe to. I mean, where else are you going to get your news from Twitter? I mean, Joseph, do you read the New York Times?
I do from time to time. I read many different news sources. A great deal of them are on the left, some are on the right. I don't take any of them necessarily very seriously unless I think that what they say is self evidently true, which is to say that there's been some sort of evidence provided to corroborate it. I generally perceive nowadays news articles as being opinion pieces, even when they're not labeled as such, just because bias has grown so rampant in this day and age.
But I mean, once you know, for example, I'm right wing, so for me, I regard inequality as natural, and I believe that people are built with different skills, different proclivities. I don't believe that we're born a blank slate. Once you know where I'm coming from, then whatever someone else's perspective is, they can kind of deal with me.